Good evening, everybody. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Rowan Jaines from the University of Sheffield. She's a lecturer in human environmental geography and co-author of the book that we are reading, Our House, Nature's Calendar. The title of this webinar is Woodlands Are Punk. You may have also seen it advertised as an alternative view of woodlands. I just wanted to get as many people to this as possible. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Rowan and you can tell us about this intriguing webinar, which is unlike any we have had before. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for inviting me, Sarah. This was just such a lovely opportunity to just think around some of the concepts that I used in the book that I published with Lula Ellender and Kira Chapman and Rebecca Warren, which is Nature's Calendar, the Year in 72 Seasons, and the work that I do for the University of Sheffield, where I'm a lecturer in human environmental geography. And really, I was trying to think of the best way to kind of distill what I do. And I think the easiest way to kind of condense it down is to say that there's this idea of nature that kind of arises in the 16th, 17th century. You know, prior to that, there was a really different thing going on. But we see this kind of this revolution in thinking, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment. You know, we end up with these tools for measuring matter and for measuring action, and the world starts to get really metricized. And with that, you begin to move towards a view of the city as the designed and cultural and political space, and nature and the countryside as this kind of apolitical, acultural, sorry, I said conservative about the city, didn't I? I meant the city as being kind of a political space, and nature and the countryside as being this kind of conservative, apolitical zone. And that's not the whole story. And what I'm really interested in as a researcher and a writer is the counter narratives that are concealed underneath what seems like common sense. And so when Sarah asked me to do this webinar, I do apologize if my puppy starts barking. Yeah, when Sarah asked me to do this, the phrase came to mind, woodlands are punk. And I thought, I can't do a talk on that. That doesn't make any sense. And it was in that moment that I realized that actually what we've got there is what Marxist scholars might call a dialectic, which is this idea that there's two separate ideas that seem not to have very much to do with each other, that are actually kind of connected by some underlying meanings and underlying kind of narratives that we rely on to structure the world without really thinking about them very much. And so I thought, you know, it's quite a nice kind of poetic phrase, and that's another thing that I do quite a lot. There's an article coming out in a book called Rural Imaginations with some scholars from Amsterdam, where I'm really trying to think through the idea of how we can use the idea of poetic fragments, you know, little statements that have more in them than their literal meaning, as ways to kind of engage with nature rather than just art, which is kind of what that kind of metaphorical stuff has been used for before. And so, yeah, so what where I got to with that was, you know, well, this is kind of the crux of my work. Like, why would a woodland not be punk? And I guess I was born in the mid-80s and I grew up in the 90s. And I guess I was really used to seeing the older people in my town kind of being, which was a small rural market town, being quite involved with the Reclaim the Streets movement. And also, you know, lots of the stuff was kind of swampy and the protection of woodland. So there was this idea of, well, where did that go? You know,
Rowan, I'm really sorry to interrupt, sweetheart. I think we can hear your dog quite. Yeah. He's louder than a Hot Wheel, it turns out.
me do something about that.
A little snack, maybe. Sorry, everyone. Yeah, while Rowan's sorting the dog out, I will explain the reason this got to. Oh, she's back. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, he should be all right now. So we're kind of in this place where we've got this statement, and it seemed to offer the opportunity to kind of pull apart some of these assumptions. And one of the reasons that we think that Woodlands can't be punk is because that's how we imagine a punk. We think of, you know, he's not a guy who's in the countryside. This is a city dweller from the mid to late 20th century. He's still having a bit of a chat. He's not whiffing anymore. Yeah, so there's this figure that emerged in the late 1970s as a kind of a response to a certain cultural movement in which music and the city were coming together to present new exciting opportunities to young people. And the city was this kind of exciting not necessarily totally benign kind of zone in which some darkness and difficulty can be integrated into the experience. And really that's what punk was about. It's not just nice, it's nasty too. It's a bit grotty, but it's also about coming together, and it's about doing stuff yourself. And so I started getting kind of interested in where this term comes from, because it's not a new term. It was first recorded in around 1575. And it was, I don't know who it is attributed to. I think we're not sure. But its first recorded use is in a ballad called Simon the Old King. And it's a ballad that warns men that drinking is a sin akin to keeping prostitutes. And it goes, so fellows, if you be drunks, or frailty, it is a sin, as it is a sin to keep a punk. And then later, Shakespeare kind of picked up the word and was using it in Measure for Measure, in the scene in which Lucio tries to explain Mariana's cryptic denial that she's neither maid, widow, nor wife by declaring she may be a punk. So we have this term that's kind of emerging during the late 16th century, early 17th century, as a word that kind of it denotes to liminality, and it denotes to sexuality and a certain kind of corporeality, and a certain degree of transgression. But I think what's really super interesting about that is that prior to that, it was the word spunk kind of is the etymological root of punk, and that comes from the Scottish Gaelic word spong, which is tinder, pith, or spung, or sponge. And it's attested that, you know, this is a word that refers to touchwood or tinder, but also a kind of colloquial sense of courage and pluck and mettle. You know, this idea of a kind of a brightness inside, some sort of kind of what we'd, you know, if you're thinking in Freudian terms, you know, something that isn't the cultured kind of super ego, the part of you that strolls along a city street and knows how to appreciate all of the fine wares in a department store window, but more the part of you that would respond if somebody tried to hurt your children or burn down your house or something a little bit more kind of animal. And what I think is really interesting within this is the movement that was happening at that time. So if you look at, I'm a geographer, and so I'm really interested in spatiality, and I'm interested in planning and what those things tell us about what people value. So around this time, we're having a kind of a revolution in the way that we manage land, both within the UK and outside of the UK. So with it's the start of mercantile colonialism. It's the start of going out and making places in the image of what a structured state should be. And it's at this time that you start to see cities moving away from the old kind of medieval format in which you see concentric circles. And so if you think of a city like Norwich or York, it's a set of concentric circles coming out from a holy site, or in which, you know, the castle's close. You know, those two ideas are kind of intertwined, the idea of power being right at the heart of things, and then these concentric circles coming out. Around 1575, around the kind of 16th century, you started seeing this transformation of agricultural space, and wetlands in particular, which is what I did my thesis on, were the site of these kind of massive engineering projects, which developed this kind of landscape architecture of the countryside, but also an idea of an ordered space that then came into the city. So you start to see what becomes the grid system in American cities. So you've got blocks rather than these sort of strange meandering streets that kind of come from a central heart. You have a city that's arranged like a grid, but you're also managing kind of agricultural space in that way too. So what you've got is this idea coming out that there's this slightly, that nature is this thing to be tamed, and that the way to do it is to impose these kind of aesthetic rules on the countryside. And so I think the emergence of an idea of a punk, you know, somebody who is liminal, somebody who doesn't quite fit into one boundary or another, kind of signals the emergence of a new regime of tidiness of person, of the need to fit into a grid-like structure. And as we know, woodlands definitely don't do that. So moving on from that, one of the, similarly, you know, we've got a problem with woodlands in that people often don't really understand what they are. And this fluffy bunnies come in because I've got a real problem with a lot of nature campaigning, and also the way in which kind of nature is imagined quite often as being this kind of innocent thing that he's protecting. And I always think about it as the fluffy bunny problem. And what we're getting here is to this idea in which we see natural or countryside spaces outside of urban development as what I'd call acultural and non-designed. The other myth about woodlands is that trees are the only thing in them, and that they're not complicated ecosystems. You know, people think woodlands, they think trees, but actually the things that make trees, the things that make woodlands viable is the kind of bigger ecosystem, and we'll get on to that. So the thing is that prior to this kind of this shift in kind of spatial thinking, I would call it maybe a spatial logic, the woodlands and areas with trees were kind of seen in the same way as the way that we're kind of seeing the city in that kind of 1970s period where punk music emerges as a kind of response to this new kind of authoritarian structure that's coming down from Reagan and Thatcher. So you've got these people who are kind of emerging into that out of that restriction, in that way that there was this that they were introduced or emerged out of. It's almost like extra matter getting squeezed out of something when you try and press Play-Doh down into one particular shape. And I suppose if we think about the history of woodlands, we're thinking about a history of a place in which anything could happen, in which there's strange forces afoot. People go to woodlands to discover things. I'm thinking of Thomas the Rhymer. It's in a woodland that he is captured by the fairy queen, and is taken away to another realm. And I'm thinking about the start of Dante's Inferno, which begins in the middle way of our life. We go into a deep, dark wood. So there's this idea prior to this kind of ordered city, in which, you know, you've got these kind of dangerous elements involved of woodlands as this liminal place with lots of kind of energy and charge in it, in them. And what I got to wondering as I was kind of trying to devise this this talk is, what are the two things that actually bring these ideas together? So, oh no, I've lost my, I'm sorry. I need to click on it. There we go. So I'm thinking about what the intersection is between these ideas. And so what we've got is we've got woodlands and punk as this intersection of sites and identities in which transgression and not fitting in are the key, and individuality. But I want to talk a bit about individuality in a couple of minutes, because I think that there's been a crisis in the idea of individuality, and that there's been some misunderstandings about it. And I'm thinking about DIY design. So, yes. So the reason that I think that woodlands are really important in this moment in time is that we're at the intersection of two major transformations. So I want that to come up too. There we go. So we've got the AI revolution that's happening at the moment, which is another kind of, you know, people are talking. I really think that we're going to be looking back at the AI revolution as important as the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, because it is another abstraction of space and of location and of the shaping of meaning. So the issue with, you know, kind of what AI is doing is that it almost distances us even further from the impact of what we're doing. So I think there was an article a few weeks ago about how just saying please, thank you, and hi in ChatGPT is creating like way more, is just taking up phenomenal amounts of energy. And so what we get is we get convenience, but convenience, it comes at a price. It comes at a price in which we are removed. So it's, again, the Marx would call this alienation. So he talks about in the Industrial Revolution, people becoming alienated from their own ability to make things, to handle things, to form things, because instead they start selling one kind of labor on the market, and then they use their capital to then purchase things. So convenience isn't always actually about comfort or about good things. But what we're seeing with the AI revolution, as we need more and more processes, is we're seeing huge areas of the countryside being taken up by these processors and data centers. And the kind of spatial rules in terms of, you know, the idea that there's such a material implication to what's happening on our screens, I think is very far removed from us at the moment. And I think that alienation causes a kind of split that is very uncomfortable for most of us, because there is a need to touch and to have an immediate feedback and live within a kind of dynamic environment, whereas things get very flat when you're staring at a screen all day. Things get incredibly samey. And I think what's happening at the same time is we've got this climate change intensification. So we've got these ideas that were coming up in the 16th and 17th century again, of nature untamed, which is needing us to build new spatial rules. So, you know, the idea of a lot of the migrant crisis and the rhetoric around it, the idea of places being full or places having enough space or sending people home, a lot of the movement that is kind of giving rise to this rhetoric is coming from the economic implications of intensification of climate change in the global south. And this is really similar to this thing that I was talking about with the AI revolution, in which what you've got is this total removal from the implications of action. So we're not tying those things together, and it makes the world uncomfortable and confusing and difficult. And I think that woodlands kind of offer us a whole bunch of stuff that we really need as humans, but also that allows us to be punk. It allows us to take a space that is transgressive and to do something different, to kind of move away from really thinking about basing our lives in screens. So there's this idea of doing something transgressive that is against these new spatial rules, which is everybody sits at home staring at their screens, and and stuff happens. Wendy Brown, there's a political thinker called Wendy Brown who talks about neoliberalism as the separation of power, and that you get responsibility come down the pipeline straight to the individual, but the power structure that's linked to just disappears as soon as you kind of turn around and try and look for it. It's just not there. So what you get is all of this kind of rhetoric about ethical consumerism, about recycling, everything. All of those things are super great. They're really important and good, but one individual can't change stuff, and so you end up with this heavy moral burden that you're carrying around. That, I should be doing this, and I should be able to figure out how to not buy anything with palm oil in, and it takes up your time and your energy, so that you're actually sort of quite a compliant and pliable subject. And what I wanted to suggest is that the sorts of projects that Sarah's running and that you guys are all involved in are actually, they've got the potential for more than to be impactful in a really deep and profound way. So the three things I think are really important that kind of allow us to kind of really think through this the potential of kind of woodlands is they're arranged in a group of C's. So we've got curiosity, and I want to kind of go back to that first line of Dante's Inferno. In the middle way of our life, we go into a deep dark wood. And so there's this idea of curiosity being almost like an antidote to the need for the constant drive for pleasure that capitalist kind of consumer culture gives us. So like what curiosity gives us is a kind of get out of jail free card from being so centered on whether or not you're happy, because everybody's thinking about whether or not they're living their best life all the time. I find that phrase very strange, because you can't live your best life constantly. There's this that in order to do that, you would have to be in an abstraction in which there wasn't really any kind of relationship between you and your environment. And so curiosity kind of allows us to manage difficult situations and feel nourished by them without trying to turn them into a happy story. And so I think there's a really nice poem called Lost by a poet called David Wagoner. And it goes something like this. Well, it doesn't go something like this. It goes exactly like this. It goes, stand still. The trees and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. And you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. the forest breathes. Listen, it answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still, the forest knows. Where you are, you must let it find you. And I think that kind of, it brings up this, the kind of liminality that I was kind of wanting to kind of pull out of that kind of crossover between the kind of links between punk and woodlands. But it also kind of brings up this issue about not knowing, and about the way in which an ecosystem can't be known like a city street, because there are always tiny microbial elements, things that are so beyond our control: the weather, the seasons, the fungal networks. You know, you can manage a woodland so beautifully, but it's never going to be under your control. So you have to stay curious, and that really brings me to an important point that I wanted to make here. And this goes back to the kind of spatial revolution. So the thing that was happening in this point in the 16th and 17th century that I was talking about earlier, in which you kind of got the emergence of this grid system, is that there was a return to Aristotle and a return to kind of Christian Greek thought. And with that kind of comes up a bunch of ideas about the city that I think are really interesting. There was a poet-philosopher called Hesiod, and he was writing just before Plato, because Plato called him the biggest liar. And his whole thing was this idea of the city as the political space, and then the countryside as the area that feeds it, is daft, and it's going to lead to ruin. He says, you know, we can't do that because, and the way that he puts it is that Zeus is not a benign god. Zeus also is not a god that makes sense all of the time. He's a trickster. And so the only way to manage that is through curiosity and care, and through everybody having some degree of every citizen having some degree of responsibility for care for the environment and for the production of food that comes with it, because you need this kind of constant diversity of different kind of food growing areas in order to really keep the city sustainable. He was saying, you know, if you've got a grain barn that's full of grain, it only takes a fire, and there's a lot of people who die from malnutrition if you're arranging it in this way, in which you have this node right in the center where you have the city, and then outside it you have the space that feeds it. And there's also a bunch of hierarchical stuff that happens within that I could talk about for hours, but I won't bore you, where it leads to a kind of bifurcation of people as well. So the people who work in the fields are seen as more akin to animals, and then there's this kind of removal of subjectivity from them that kind of condones slavery. And so there's all of these things about curiosity and about not taking things for granted that are really emancipatory and that can be found in a forest. You know, as this David Wagner says, you know, stand still, the forest knows where you are, you must let it find you. And second, kind of leading on from that, is complexity. So going back to, you know, the reason that we need curiosity is because the world is more complex than we can imagine it when we're looking from this kind of grid system way, or you might want to call it a double column bookkeeping system. You know, this idea of input and output, that you have to be able to measure it all. Actually, you know, ecosystems, forests, woodlands, you all know if you have worked with them, they don't work like that. They're curious and they're complex, and but that doesn't mean that they are not designed. So any ecologist knows that a healthy ancient woodland is one that's been maintained. There's this idea of rewilding that doesn't really work when it comes to woodlands, because actually there's this symbiotic relationship between humans and trees, or tree environments, that kind of requires us to be co-designing with nature. And I think that that's really where I want to get us to by the end of this, is this kind of opportunity that woodlands offer us, this emancipatory and transgressive opportunity to co-design in a kind of multi-species way. So we're really thinking about, how can I nurture this environment, and that brings me lastly to craft, which is, the making of things, the making of solutions, the working with what you've got, the using waste, the making use of and working within your ecosystem to support a whole bunch of different creative endeavors. And I think, again, when we start to look at these kind of crux points, what we see, going back to that 17th century point, and we can do a bigger historical thing, but I think that seems to be a good point, to a good watermark for today, is we see this degrading of craft and the fetishization of fine art. So fine art is the output of the city or the court. It's the output of people who have time to be studying forms and making reference to those, whereas craft is more immediate, is often associated with women's activities, textiles, and or with very hands-on kind of manual labor type jobs. But the bifurcation between craft and art, I think, is also something that we're starting to see kind of undo itself in a thing that is so it feels like the AI revolution is taking us to this kind of breaking point in which you're getting a lot of people just really actually want to be doing things with their hands again and interacting in something material. And I think there's a real opportunity there to be thinking of craft and thinking of rural crafts, of nature-based crafts, and really thinking how we can support them to be seen as valid as what we call high art forms. And then lastly is community. An ecosystem is a community is an ecosystem. And spaces like the one that Sarah's made and invited me into this evening, and spaces like I know you guys maintain, that is again this like key a key output or key opportunity that woodlands are kind of giving us in this moment to really start to come together and co-design with nature as part of our community. And one of the things that I'd really like to do, I've got a Google form that I'll share in the chat before I go, is that I have been working on a map of all the ancient woodlands in the UK, an annotated map that gives some information about each of them, but I want to combine that with some of the newer projects that people are doing. So we've got this kind of map of these kind of ancient areas that have been important to people for a long time, and also simultaneously as part of that, things that people are doing now in so that they're kind of together on that map. So if anybody is interested in that, I will put the link in the chat. But for now, I think that's everything from me, and I hope that was at least interesting for people. Thank you.
Bravo. Thank you so much, Rowan. If this was a punk gig, we'd be shouting encore, encore for more, please. So
Thanks.
I think I should explain a little bit about how our first meeting came about and how we got veered off onto the punk aspect. And that is because I play in two punk bands, actually, or well, I just play in one now. And we got talking, didn't we, Rowan, about doing a webinar. And it was originally going to be about your book, but then we got talking about how curious it is that the punk community and the woodland community is actually quite closely combined. And the reason I know this is because when I've been to wood fairs, some of the people that I would see at festivals where my band have played, I was seeing them at the Woodland festivals, and in fact, I know Petra. Are you here tonight? And I know her from nothing to do with Woodland. It's just a complete coincidence that she's here. Um, so, and this isn't the first time I've snuck a cheeky little punk webinar in, because if any of you are local to Leicestershire or you follow our SWOG channel on YouTube, I had a guy called Dave the Fungal Punk, and he's really into fungus, obviously, but also punk music, and he's a promoter in the punk community, but also a great advocate for nature as well. So when we back to, I'm going to make reference, Rowan, to you talking about people living their best life. And I thought that was quite interesting because on social media, which is the flat sort of like the sort of the screen based living, people filter and they put a filter in a different aspect on their life, which isn't real, is it? They like, for example, I don't mind showing you in the background here. It looks very plain and like my house is very organized and minimal, but I'm actually packing to go away. I don't mind showing you real life. My real house is I've got a camping trip booked tomorrow. My actual behind what you can see in real life is actually a little bit of chaos. So I really like you making reference to that, because that is true, and that's not the first time I've thought that either. So basically, just thank you so much for such an interesting, thought-provoking talk. If we have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and if you can each take the URL for this so that we can share it. And actually, Rowan, if you email it me as well, I can make sure we can get it onto I can get it sent out on our email shop as well.
Oh, great.
And while the camera's rolling, I will talk to you about future webinars. I know I said it before, but not everybody was here then. On Thursday, the 12th of June, we have a therapeutic work for children in a woodland setting with our SWOG regular Sue Coombs. And on the Monday, the 7th of July, we have Connecting to Nature, Wellbeing and Resilience Through Trees. And also, just to make reference to the community spirit and the DIY spirit of the woodland community, we had a talk a few months ago now from the Forest Plastic Working Group. And the guy who runs that, he has a sort of rather unenviable task of trying to map where all of the plastic tree gods are and trying to change them for more sustainable versions. And you might think, oh, that seems like such a difficult task, but he's doing it one by one, and that's quite, with a sense of community. And actually with this, we said, oh, why don't we use, DOV working groups? They all need to do a task that is rooted in something that's community spirited, and we linked him with that. And you know what? We've got a few more hands on deck now because of sort of a do-it-yourself attitude. And so I really like that. That's punk. So I don't look like a punk that you think. I don't have a mohawk. I've got a French bob like every other 40-year-old woman. So, but I played a punk band. So I think you might not know it, but I'd like you all to think, actually, when you tell people, oh, we've purchased a plot of woodland. A lot of people, when I tell people that we purchased a bit of woodland, they look at you like you've grown another head, and a lot of people say, why? But I say, why not? Why wouldn't you? If you can, why wouldn't you? So I think it's all quite cool and quite different, and that's why we're all in SWOG. So quite punk in itself. We've got a question here popped through from Mike. Where do you feel the crossover from the natural environment being norm to the urban city tech life relegating woodland to the punk? Where would you feel the crossover is? What do you make of that question, Rowan?
So I think the best answer that I've got to that is Capability Brown's landscaping. So if you go back to the kind of mid-16th century, you kind of got these this new understanding of what a plot could be for a aristocratic kind of pile. And one of my favorite but also most awful stories, it just kind of shines a dark light on the way things are, is that so there's an estate which the Spencers lived on, and in which one of the I think so I think some of the Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser was kind of based on this estate. And so it was owned by the Earl of Pembroke, and he had this idea that he was going to turn the wider estate into his own private kind of Arcadia, his heaven on earth. And what that involved was pushing the edges of the estate where normal folk, peasants, were living in a small patch of woodland, and using that and using the natural resources, and living maybe not their best, but they were living their lives. And they said they wouldn't move because they said, well, you've got a massive estate already. Like, we're doing, this is where we've been for a really long time. And in response to that, what he did was he went to his another area in Pembrokeshire, and he marched peasants under threat of death to this estate, and then got some peasants from one place to kill the peasants on the other place, and then they chopped down the trees and made a nice kind of landscaped area. And so what you've got is this kind of idea of ownership of space, of certain kind of aesthetic that you want, which is these kind of grand vistas and all productive land. And so woodland and these kind of small scale woodlands, they don't really feature within that kind of grid system that's emerging. I don't know if that makes sense for Mike G.
I've just muted myself. Sorry. No, that does make sense. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we have a question. I think you said you disagreed with some current efforts to conserve or defend nature, or perhaps some nature activists. Could you elaborate?
Oh, yes. So I think I don't ever disagree with any efforts to conserve or defend nature, but I do disagree with the idea of nature as a benign or a gentle force, the kind of fluffy bunny view of nature, because it's I don't know, to me that feels disrespectful, because nature is so much bigger and more powerful and more mysterious than we give it credit for in some of the way. I think some of it is just about kind of trying to dumb things down to make them packageable and marketable so that you can raise funds for campaign groups. But I think what it does is it kind of detooths nature in a way that is deeply harmful to all of us in kind of psychological ways, as well as actually the things that we decide to give to prioritize in terms of policy. And because if something's detoothed, then why would you respect it?
It's quite interesting, right? For example, the WWF, their logo is the panda. Sometimes people lean into it, like they've chosen quite a but yeah, they didn't pick I don't know, like a snake or something.
Yeah, it's funny because that's such a different view of nature to ones that have come previously, or ones that you see in indigenous cultures. There's I think sometimes respect actually comes from having a bit of fear from things, and I think we should be fearful of nature because it's massive and powerful. And I think if we had a bit more fear of it, then we would rectify things and systems quicker than we are at the moment.
Yeah. Someone from North Devon said, I enjoyed the talk very much, but I'm not completely sure I understood it all. Is there anything that you could suggest to help understand? And will you be writing anything? Well, yeah, I think you've written plenty.
Yeah, well, so I'm trying to think off the top of my head what The Country and the City by Raymond Williams is the book that you want, I think, is A. Hay. I think I think Raymond Williams was a kind of beautiful writer, and the book's slightly outdated, but I think it's coming up to a big anniversary, and I should think there'll be a new edition that comes out soon. But he really does he was a Welsh working class guy who ended up in Cambridge University, I think, as a literature scholar, and he wrote this beautiful book called The Country and the City, about the presentation of nature and the countryside and urban and the city in English literature, and kind of paved the way for a lot of kind of cultural critique after that.
Thank you. That's a good recommendation. We'll pop that in the in our newsletter as well, just to expand people's reading. Adrian Brewster asks a question, an impossible question. He says, my wood allows me to think that I am acting as if I'm already free. And a central point in my life can grow from, although the reality is that in the UK, these spaces are not transgressive, but have a long history of being heavily policed, e.g. the planner's mangled his composting toilet. And how can we grow that anarchist punkish ethos so that we can really be free?
I don't know. Maybe we just have to keep talking, Adrian. I think we just have to keep talking and doing stuff together. I wish I'm an academic. I'm not very good at solutions. I'm just good at criticizing things and wringing my hands. Sorry. If I had solutions, I'd be like a planner or one of these other people. And this is the problem, is that we get kind of bifurcated into these different roles, don't we? If you've got a critical mind, you tend to get sidelined into an area where you're doing what I do, wringing my hands, and oh dear, that's bad. And people who are like, yeah, let's just do, who are a bit reckless, they become the people who kind of make decisions, and kind of need I don't have an answer to that.
The answer I would give is, as a little punk at heart, is always keep a bit of resistance there. Always keep pushing. Off you go. Off you go. Oh, my son's tooth has just fallen out. I do apologise.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, it's a wobbler. It's about to fall out. Okay, sweetheart.
That's really exciting. So the tooth fairy will come.
Okay. Oh, another thing that would combine woodlands and punk is, I said to some of you, if any of you would like to email me and tell me where your woodlands are, I will tell you where the local festivals are, because another way that the punk and the woodland community cross over is when there are festivals, they need wood to have their big bonfires around in the evenings, and they need woodland donors to supply the wood. So I know some of you have emailed me already, but some of the big festivals, they will use you as a source of wood, and you can, I don't know, sell it to them. So
the sort of thing that I would really like the map to be useful for people for, once we've kind of got it populated a bit. So you've got some of that cultural stuff underneath, but you've also got opportunities on there, and opportunities for people to interact if they're close together, or swap resources, or all of that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, even better, swap your wood for a ticket. That's Peter says, in Scandinavia, children are kept outside and learn from nature. Many don't start school lessons until 7. Do you think this approach would help us all to reconnect with nature?
Yeah.
Because I'm a teacher by trade. I know that the Japanese education system, they looked at the Scandinavian model and they wanted to adopt it, but I think culturally it was too different. But I think it would help. Yeah, they're quite progressive, aren't they?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't have any more. I just think yes, that's my only answer to that, Peter.
Yeah. Yeah, Peter agrees too. Yeah, I taught in Finland for a while, and yeah, it was cool.
True.
Is that all of our questions?
I think so. Oh. Are you off on tooth fairy duty now, Sarah?
I think I might be. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Last week we were in France, and I really wanted his tooth to fall out last week in France because they have a tooth mouse instead of a fairy. I thought that'd be quite cool, but the fairy's coming tonight, turns out, so I best go and sort that out. But listen, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Rowan, thank you so much for such a different and literally an alternative talk for us. Really enjoyable. I'm sure, I know I'll have lots of follow-up questions, so I'll be in touch with you via email. If you have anything you'd like to promote, any of your future books, any of your future questionnaires, anything for your students, send it to me and I will send it on to our guys in SWOG, and we're always happy to help. We're a really friendly community, like I said before. Thank you so much. Terrific. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, the rest of you SWOGers. Thanks for always joining. It wouldn't be a community without the rest of you. Any questions, email them to sarah@swog.org.uk, and see you for the next one. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye.